The arrow drawn by the tribal hunter didn't just burn, it consumed the very concept of space around it. To Vivan's eye of Rudra, there was no trajectory line. The glowing blue path didn't exist, because dodging was a mortal concept. This was Lord Shiva. When the destroyer loosed an arrow, it did not travel from the bow to the target. It simply arrived. System, Vivan said, his voice entirely devoid of panic, replaced by an absolute, freezing hyperfocus. Divert all Yuga vitality to regeneration. Prepare for catastrophic tissue damage. The hunter released the string. There was no sound. The world went perfectly, utterly silent. The blizzard stopped mid-air. Vivan didn't try to dodge. He activated his diamond dust shield, stacking 3 layers of concentrated Earthrealm prana in front of his chest. Behind the shields, he manifested his phantom double, placing the clone directly in front of him as a meat shield. Finally, he raised the Anant of Ambrace, drawing the ethereal purple string back to its absolute limit, channeling every drop of solar energy into the gauntlet. The arrow struck. The 3 layers of the diamond dust shield didn't shatter, they simply ceased to exist, erased by the apocalyptic fire. The phantom double was vaporized instantly, the backlash violently tearing at Vivan's soul. Vivan fired the Anant of Ambrace, not at the hunter, but directly point-blank into the tip of Shiva's descending arrow. The collision of cosmic dark matter and divine destruction created a miniature supernova on the Himalayan ridge. The sheer, unfathomable kinetic feedback blew Vivan's right arm backward. The bones in his forearm, despite being mythic tier iron, fractured in a dozen places. His flesh tore, spraying blood onto the white snow. But the blast diverted the trajectory of Shiva's arrow by exactly 1 millimeter. The arrow grazed Vivan's left shoulder, taking a chunk of flesh with it, before plunging into the mountain behind him. The entire peak of the mountain silently crumbled into ash. Vivan fell to his knees in the snow, gasping for air, clutching his shattered right arm. His Yuga vitality immediately rushed to the wounds, fighting a desperate war against the residual divine fire burning in his flesh. He had survived. Barely. The tribal hunter lowered his bow, walking through the settling ash. He stopped a few feet from Vivan, looking down at the bleeding anomaly with eyes that held the birth and death of stars. You broke the absolute, Shiva murmured, a note of genuine cosmic amusement in his voice. A mortal who bends the trajectory of fate. The weavers of destiny hate you, anomaly. You are a loose thread in the tapestry. Vivan gritted his teeth, looking up. I just want to survive the storm, Lord. Shiva smiled, a serene expression that calmed the raging blizzard around them. There is no surviving the storm, Shadow. You must become it. The earth will soon drink the blood of millions. Ensure your blade is sharp. The hunter turned and walked into the blizzard, fading from reality. He had an avatar of Indra to test on the next peak. Vivan collapsed fully into the snow, letting out a ragged, bloody laugh. The golden interface flared, blindingly bright. Ding. Supreme cosmic event survived, the gaze of the destroyer. Host successfully deflected an absolute tear attack. Reward, supreme insight, the void step. Effect, Windwalker steps has evolved. The host can now step through the interstitial fabric of space, allowing for instantaneous, short-range teleportation, max range, 50 meters, by folding physical reality. Costs immense prana. Vivan closed his eyes. The pain was agonizing, but the reward was terrifying. He could teleport. Chapter 57, The Kingdom of Disguise 7 years later. The 13th year of exile. The terms of the dice game were brutal. After 12 years of wandering the forests, the Pandavas were required to spend their final, 13th year in Agyatavasa living incognito in society. If anyone from Hastinapur recognized them, the 13-year exile would begin all over again. They chose the prosperous Matsya kingdom, ruled by King Virata. Yudhishthira disguised himself as a royal courtier. Bhima became the head cook. Nakula and Sahadeva tended the stables and cattle. Arjuna, cursed by an apsara to lose his manhood for a year, took the form of Brihanala, a eunuch dance instructor for the princesses. And Draupadi, the proud empress, swallowed her pride to become Sarandri, a humble maidservant to the queen. It was the perfect hiding place. But they needed a shadow to watch the doors. Deep in the damp, torch-lit dungeons of King Virata's palace, the royal torturer sharpened a massive iron cleaver on a whetstone. The torturer was a terrifying figure, a towering man wearing a heavy, black iron executioner's mask that covered his entire face. He was completely mute, hired a month prior by the dungeon master for his unparalleled strength and his ability to make prisoners disappear without a trace. Behind the iron mask, Vivan smiled, listening to the rhythmic shhhk of the whetstone. It was the ultimate cover. Nobody looked closely at the executioner. He had full access to the darkest, most secure parts of the palace, allowing him to use his shadow weaver's cloak to patrol the castle at night and watch over the disguised Pandavas. He was incredibly close to his goal. The void step had allowed him to hunt down and assassinate 2 more calamity tier beasts during the last years of the forest exile. Host status check. Cultivation, Earthrealm, absolute peak, dot. Requirement for Skyrealm breakthrough, 1 calamity tier core remaining. Just 1 more. But Vivan couldn't leave the palace to hunt. The 13th year was the most dangerous time in the timeline. Duryodhana had unleashed thousands of spies across the continent, desperate to find the Pandavas before the year was up. And a local threat was already brewing right above Vivan's head. Through the damp ceiling of the dungeon, Vivan's karmic weaver skill detected a sickeningly thick, vile red string of fate pulsing with predatory intent. It was connected to Kichaka, the commander of Virida's army and the queen's brother. Kichaka had seen Draupadi in her maid disguise, and the arrogant commander had decided he wanted to claim her. Vivan set down the iron cleaver. The lore dictated that Bhima would kill Kichaka for this insult. But a dead supreme commander would bring heavy scrutiny to the palace, scrutiny the Pandavas could not afford. Time to clean up a mess, Vivan muttered, melting into the shadows of the dungeon wall. Chapter 58, The Beast in the Dance Hall. It was the dark of the moon. The grand royal dance hall of Virida was entirely empty, save for a single oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows across the polished marble floor. Kichaka, drunk on lotus wine and his own arrogant power, stumbled into the hall. Draupadi had told him to meet her here in secret. Sarandri. Kichaka called out, a cruel, lustful smile on his face. Where are you hiding, my sweet maid? From the shadows near the musician's alcove, a massive figure stood up. It wasn't Draupadi. It was Bhima, disguised in a woman's shawl. I am right here, Kichaka, Bhima growled, dropping the shawl. The Pandava's eyes burned with a wrath that had been simmering for 13 years. Kichaka, a legendary wrestler in his own right, sobered instantly. He drew his hidden dagger. The fight was brutal, silent, and contained. They didn't use cosmic weapons, they used raw, bone-breaking force to avoid alerting the palace guards. Kichaka fought like a cornered tiger, but Bhima was an avatar of the wind god. Within minutes, Bhima had the commander pinned. With a sickening twist, Bhima snapped Kichaka's limbs and crushed his skull, rendering the body entirely unrecognizable. Bhima stood up, panting, covered in the commander's blood. He needed to get back to the kitchens before the changing of the guard. But as Bhima turned to leave, the heavy wooden doors of the dance hall began to rattle. Kichaka had brought his elite personal guard 30 armored mercenaries and instructed them to wait outside. Hearing the scuffle, they were breaking the locks. Bhima cursed. If he was caught covered in Kichaka's blood, the exile was over. Suddenly, the oil lamp in the center of the room extinguished. Absolute darkness fell. Go, Prince, a voice whispered from the shadows, directly into Bhima's ear. It was a voice altered by prana, deep and echoing. The shadows will bury the dead. Bhima didn't hesitate. Trusting the unseen guardian that had watched over them for over a decade, he slipped out through a high window. The heavy doors burst open. The 30 mercenaries poured in, holding torches, illuminating the crushed corpse of their commander. Murder, the captain yelled. Seal the palace. Find the swish. The captain's head separated from his shoulders before he could finish the sentence. From the darkness of the high ceiling, Vivan descended like a nightmare. He didn't use the solar meridian. He didn't use loud kinetic strikes. He used the silent, brutal efficiency of his Mala Yada mastery and the iron cleaver he had brought from the dungeon. Vivan activated Void Step. He folded space, disappearing from the center of the room and instantly rematerializing directly behind 3 mercenaries. The heavy iron cleaver sheared through their armor like wet paper. He Void Stepped again, appearing in the rafters, dropping down to crush 2 skulls with his titan's grip, and sinking back into the shadows using his cloak. To the mercenaries, it was a slaughter in a haunted house. They swung wildly at the dark, their torches revealing only glimpses of a terrifying iron executioner's mask before they died. In less than 60 seconds, 30 men lay dead. Ding. Covered operation successful. Task, maintain the Agyatavasa, the secret exile, dot. Reward, massive prana influx. Host's Earthrealm core has reached absolute saturation. Vivan stood amidst the carnage, his iron mask splattered with blood. He grabbed Kichaka's corpse and the bodies of the mercenaries, throwing them all into his devourer's vault. He would dump them in a ravine miles outside the city tomorrow. When the sun rose, Kichaka and his guard had simply vanished. Virida remained safe. But the disappearance of the commander reached the ears of Hastinapur. Duryodhana smiled. Kichaka was dead? Only one man had the strength to kill him like that. Bhima. They are in Virida, Duryodhana declared. Summon Bhishma, Drona, and Karna. Mobilize the entire Kuru army. We march on Matsya to expose the rats before the 13th year ends. Chapter 59, The cattle raid. The invasion of Virida was swift and overwhelming. Duryodhana didn't declare open war, he ordered a massive cattle raid. By stealing the kingdom's wealth, he forced the Virida army to ride out and defend their borders. The Kuru army, a terrifying sea of chariots, elephants, and hundreds of thousands of heavily armored soldiers, descended upon the Matsya borders. With King Virida and his main army distracted by a diversionary force, Duryodhana, Bhishma, Drona, and Karna led the main Kuru army directly toward the vulnerable capital. The only royal left in the palace was the young, terrified Prince Uttar. I cannot fight them. Uttar wept in the armory. Bhishma? Drona? Karna? I am a dead man. You will not fight them alone, my prince, a soft, feminine voice said. Stepping into the armory was Brihanala, the eunuch dance teacher. Arjuna. Arjuna let down his braided hair. He wiped the cosmetics from his face. The curse of the Apsara had expired exactly 1 day ago. The 13th year was officially over. The Pandavas were free. Drive my chariot, Prince Uttar, Arjuna commanded, his voice returning to the deep, resonant timbre of the world's greatest archer. Take me to the Sami tree outside the city. I have weapons buried there. High atop the outer walls of Virida, Vivan stood cloaked in shadow, watching the massive dust cloud of the approaching Kuru army on the horizon. He didn't care about the main battle. Arjuna retrieving the Gandiva bow and single-handedly routing the entire Kuru army was a canon event. Arjuna would use the Samohana Astra, a weapon of mass sleep, to knock out the entire enemy army and secure victory. Vivan's eye of Rudra wasn't focused on the Kuru commanders. He was scanning the rear guard of Duryodhana's army. There, pulling massive siege towers, were two Gayendra's primordial, calamity tier war elephants, beasts of dark magic imported by Shakuni from the deep south. My final core, Vivan whispered. Vivan stepped off the wall, activating his Windwalker steps. He flew over the plains, a blur of dark speed, completely bypassing the vanguard of the army. He landed in a rocky outcrop overlooking the Kuru rear guard. The two monstrous elephants towered over the infantry, their tusks plated in celestial steel. Vivan manifested the Anant of Embrace. He didn't have time for a drawn-out fight. Arjuna was already approaching the battlefield, the Gandiva humming with divine fury. Vivan drew the ethereal purple string back to his ear. He channeled every single drop of Earthrealm prana in his body, pulling heavily on the ambient heat of the sun using his Agni Astra fragment to supercharge the shot. The solar meridian screamed, the golden light turning a blinding, terrifying white. Pierce, Vivan commanded. He released the string. The Mach 4 kinetic railgun bolt tore across the battlefield. It was so fast the Kuru soldiers didn't even see a flash. The beam struck the first calamity tier elephant perfectly in the temple, blowing a clean hole through its massive skull. The beam didn't stop. It carried its momentum straight through the first beast and struck the second elephant standing directly behind it, vaporizing its spinal column. Both massive, demonic beasts collapsed simultaneously, their sheer weight crushing dozens of siege engines in a cloud of dust. Ding! Dual calamity tier targets eliminated. Cores secured. Requirement met, 3/3 calamity cores harvested. Vivan didn't wait to see the chaos he had just caused in the Kuru rear guard. He activated Void Step, folding space to teleport 50 meters backward, then chained Windwalker steps to vanish into the rocky canyons bordering the battlefield. Behind him, the sky suddenly turned a brilliant, mesmerizing purple. Arjuna had fired the Samohana Astra. The entire Kuru army including Duryodhana, Drona, and Karna slumped over in their chariots, falling into an unbreakable magical slumber. The exile was over. The Pandavas had won. Chapter 60, Ascension. On the eve of war deep within a secluded, echoing canyon miles away from the sleeping army, Vivan sat cross-legged on the bare rock. The air was deadly still. He had placed the final calamity tier core, a massive, pulsing heart of dark, earthen magic, into his mouth and swallowed. Ding. Integration initiated. The host is attempting to breach the sky realm, demigod tier. Warning, the mortal vessel is rejecting the divine density. Commencing heavenly tribulation. The sky above the canyon violently darkened. This wasn't Indra's reign. This was the cosmos reacting to a mortal stealing the authority of the gods. A bolt of pure, unadulterated cosmic lightning struck Vivan directly on the crown of his head. Vivan didn't scream. His jaw locked so tight his teeth cracked. His iron bone physique glowed a blinding, cherry red under the heat of the celestial current. His Yuga vitality was pushed to its absolute limit, his flesh incinerating and regenerating in the same fraction of a second. He forced his mind into the fortress of his Brahmand gaze. He remembered the universal form he had seen in Krishna's mouth as a child. He aligned his fragile, mortal soul with the infinite, uncaring rotation of the galaxies. I am not a thread, Vivan thought, the cosmic lightning trying to erase him from existence. I am the needle. He forced his meridians open. He didn't just absorb the core, he absorbed the lightning of the tribulation itself, dragging the heavenly energy down into his dension, core, and violently compressing it. The pressure mounted until it felt like a star was collapsing inside his chest. And then, the resistance shattered. A shockwave of pure, golden white prana exploded from Vivan's body, instantly vaporizing the walls of the canyon for 100 yards in every direction. The dark clouds above were blown away, revealing the clear, peaceful sky of the late afternoon. Vivan slowly opened his eyes. They no longer looked entirely human. The irises possessed a faint, shifting ring of golden light. Ding. Tribulation survived. Congratulations. The host has successfully breached the sky realm, demigod tier. Prana has evolved into Ajas, divine energy. Host now possesses the physical baseline required to wield and survive supreme celestial astras, divine weapons. Vivan stood up. He didn't feel heavy anymore. He felt as though gravity was merely a suggestion. He clenched his fist, and the air around his knuckles audibly cracked from the sheer pressure of his aura. He was no longer just an assassin or a shadow. He was a force of nature. He was on par with the titans of the era. He pulled out his Devourer's Vault interface. He had hoarded demonic weapons, celestial armor scraps from the forest fire, and mountains of gold. But he needed more. He needed an army's worth of supplies for what was coming. Because miles away, in the royal court of Virida, Yudhishthira had just revealed his true identity to the king. The Pandavas shed their disguises, donning their royal armor. Word would reach Hastinapur immediately. Duryodhana would refuse to return Indraprastha, claiming Arjuna had broken his disguise before the 13th year had fully ended. Krishna would go to Hastinapur as a peace messenger, and Duryodhana would foolishly try to arrest the Supreme Lord. Peace was an illusion. System alert, the prologue is complete. Main scenario initiated, the Kurukshetra War. Countdown to the 18 days of annihilation, 6 months. Vivan pulled his dark cowl over his head, his golden eyes glowing in the shadow. 6 months, Vivan whispered, stepping out of the ruined canyon. Time to go to Dwarka. I need a word with Krishna before the world burns. Chapter 61, The Golden City of the Sea. The city of Dwarka was not built on the earth, it was forged upon the ocean. To Vivan, looking down from a high cliff on the western coast of the Aryavarta, it was the most breathtaking sight he had encountered in this era. Dwarka was an island fortress of pure, glittering gold and white crystal, connected to the mainland by a massive, heavily guarded bridge. It radiated a divine, impregnable aura. He didn't need to walk the bridge. Vivan activated his newly evolved void step. The fabric of space folded around him. He didn't just move fast, he simply ceased to be on the cliff and instantly rematerialized 50 meters over the crashing waves. He chained the steps flawlessly in mid-air. Fold. Appear. Fold. Appear, bypassing the outer fleet of Yadeva warships and the elite perimeter guards entirely. He landed softly on the highest balcony of the central palace, his dark cloak billowing in the salty sea breeze. You bypass the divine wards of Dwarka as if they were made of parchment, a voice echoed from the shadowed archway of the balcony. Vivan didn't flinch. His eye of Rudra had already plotted the trajectory of the speaker's heavy, balanced battle axe. Stepping into the sunlight was Satyaki, Krishna's greatest general and a warrior of terrifying prowess. Satyaki's eyes were narrowed, his massive axe thrumming with celestial energy. I am not here to fight you, General, Vivan said calmly. He didn't drop his mythic aura concealment, but he allowed a microscopic fraction of his new sky realm aegis to leak into the air. The ambient pressure on the balcony spiked. The marble floor beneath Vivan's boots groaned. Satyaki's eyes widened in sheer shock. The general felt the weight of a demigod pressing against his chest. He tightened his grip on his axe, preparing for a death match. Stand down, Satyaki. He is an expected guest. The golden doors of the balcony swung open. Krishna stepped out. He wore no armor, only the simple yellow silks of a prince at peace, but the peacock feather in his crown seemed to hold the weight of the sky. Satyaki bowed deeply and retreated, though he cast a highly suspicious glare at Vivan. Krishna leaned against the marble railing, looking out over the endless blue ocean. 13 years in the wilderness, Vivan. You went into the forests as a shadow hiding from the light. You return as a tempest. I felt the tribulation in the Himalayas. Shiva was amused by your defiance. Vivan pulled his cowl back, revealing his face and his faintly glowing golden irises. He bowed respectfully. The war is inevitable, Lord, Vivan said. Duryodhana will not return a single speck of dirt to the Pandavas. I have come to offer my sword. But I do not want to be a foot soldier in the infantry. I want a specific role. Krishna smiled, his dark eyes turning toward Vivan. You possess a weapon forged of cosmic dark matter and the strength to shatter mountains. You do not belong in the infantry. But you also cannot fight the main commanders. If you slay Bhishma or Drona or Karna, you break the karmic cycle of the Pandavas. They must defeat their own demons. Then what is my place on the board? Vivan asked. Krishna's smile faded, replaced by a cold, terrifying strategic absolute. Shakuni plays with cursed dice, Vivan. He will not fight this war with honor. He will use assassins, dark magic, and night raids to slaughter the Pandavas when their guard is down. The heavens have bound me by an oath, I will not lift a weapon in this war. I will only drive Arjuna's chariot. Krishna stepped forward, placing a hand on Vivan's shoulder. I cannot fight the shadows, Vivan. So, I am sending a monster into the dark to hunt them for me. You will be the unseen shield of the Pandavas. When Shakuni breaks the rules of war, I expect you to break Shakuni's pawns. Ding. Supreme quest initiated, the shadow of Kurukshetra. Role assigned, the unseen executioner. Objective, neutralize all covert threats, dark magic and foul play orchestrated by the Kaurava faction during the 18-day war. Reward, path to the sovereign realm. Vivan bowed deeply. Consider the shadows cleared, my lord. Chapter 62, The Gathering of the Storm. 6 months evaporated like water on a hot iron. The diplomatic missions failed catastrophically. Duryodhana, blinded by his own arrogance and the massive army he had assembled, declared that he would not yield enough land to balance on the tip of a needle. The war was declared. The battlefield chosen was Kurukshetra, a vast, flat plain known as the Field of Righteousness. Vivan arrived 3 days before the first horn was blown. He stood on a high, rocky plateau overlooking the valley. The sight was enough to make even a demigod's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't an army. It was a sea of humanity and steel. The Kaurava forces, led by the immortal grandfather Bhishma, amassed 11 Akshahinis, military divisions. Over 2 million men, tens of thousands of elephants, and chariots stretched to the horizon, their banners creating a forest of colors. Opposite them, the Pandava army, led by Drishtadyumna, amassed 7 Akshahinis. Though smaller in number, they possessed warriors of unparalleled ferocity. The sheer logistical scale of the camps was staggering. Tents spanned for miles. The smell of cooking fires, dung, and sharpening steel filled the air. Vivan didn't pitch a tent. He found a deep, natural cavern complex a few miles off the flank of the Pandava camp. He used his devourer's vault to unpack the supplies he had hoarded over 13 years. Massive iron braziers, stockpiles of dried meats, and an arsenal of high-tier mortal weapons looted from Kamsa and Kichaka's armories. He even set up a heavily reinforced meditation slab to cultivate his ajas. He was setting up his own forward operating base. That night, the eve of the Great War, the commanders of both sides met in the center of the battlefield to establish the rules of engagement. Vivan used his Shadow Weaver's cloak to melt into the dark earth, sliding silently into the central pavilion where the king sat. Bhishma, a towering figure with a white beard and an aura of absolute invincibility, laid down the laws. There will be no fighting after sunset. A warrior on a chariot may only fight another on a chariot. No striking a man who has lost his weapon. No attacking non-combatants. This war will be fought with honor. Yudhishthira agreed readily. Duryodhana smirked and nodded, though his eyes darted towards Shakuni. From the shadows of the tent canopy, Vivan's karmic weaver skill flared to life. While Bhishma spoke of honor, Vivan saw thick, rotting black strings of fate slithering between Shakuni and a group of dark, heavily cloaked tribal kings sitting in the rear of the Kaurava delegation. They were Rakshasas and mercenaries who worshipped the dark arts. They're planning to poison the Pandava water supply before the first sunrise, Vivan realized, tracing the black karmic strings. Bhishma dismissed the assembly. The commanders returned to their camps to rest for the final time. Vivan didn't rest. The rules of war were already being broken. It was time to go to work. Chapter 63, The Preemptive Strike. The Kaurava supply lines were massive, snaking miles behind their main vanguard. Vivan bypassed the sleeping armies using void step, folding space to leapfrog across the heavily patrolled plains in utter silence. He arrived at the northern reservoir, a massive series of natural lakes that the Kaurava Logistics Corps had dammed to supply water to their 11 divisions. Standing on a ridge overlooking the water, his eye of Rudra pierced the darkness. There were 50 men moving stealthily near the edge of the lake. They were not regular soldiers, they wore the dark leathers of Shakuni's elite assassins. They were unloading massive clay jars filled with a glowing, sickly green liquid from the back of an ox cart. They intended to dump the calamity tear toxin into the stream that fed directly into the Pandava encampment. System, Vivan whispered, channeling his Skyrealm mages into his arms. Let's test the new engine. Vivan didn't bother with stealth. He wanted them to know what was in the dark. He walked off the ridge, dropping 60 feet straight down. He didn't use wind or space to break his fall. He channeled his ajas into his iron bone physique and landed directly on top of the ox cart. Crash. The heavy wooden cart instantly splintered into thousands of pieces. The shockwave of his landing created a crater in the muddy bank, violently throwing the 50 assassins off their feet. The glowing clay jars of poison shattered, the green liquid hissing as it ate through the earth. Vivan, protected by his lesser poison immunity and overwhelming Skyrealm aura, was completely unaffected. What in the hells? The lead assassin screamed, drawing a curved, poisoned blade. Kill him. The 50 assassins swarmed Vivan like angry hornets. Vivan didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even use the solar meridian. He simply raised his foot and stomped the ground. An invisible shockwave of Earthrealm kinetic force rippled outward in a perfect 360-degree radius. It was a variation of his thunderclap strike, modified to an area of effect. The shockwave hit the charging assassins like a solid wall of iron. The sheer concussive force shattered their legs and ruptured their organs simultaneously. 40 of the 50 men were instantly pulverized, their bodies thrown violently into the lake. The remaining 10 assassins froze in absolute, mind-shattering horror. Vivan activated Void Step. He vanished and reappeared instantly in front of the captain, his titan's grip locking onto the man's armored throat. Vivan lifted the captain entirely off the ground. Tell Shakuni, Vivan said, his golden eyes glowing fiercely in the dark, that the game of dice is over. If he tries to poison the well again, I will bypass Bhishma, walk into your royal pavilion, and tear his spine out through his throat. Vivan threw the captain backward into the mud. Run. The remaining 10 assassins didn't hesitate. They dropped their weapons and fled into the night, screaming in terror. Ding. Covert threat neutralized. Pandava supply lines secured. Vivan looked at the ruined poison and the dead bodies. The war hadn't even started, and he was already painting the earth red. He activated his Shadow Weaver's cloak and headed back to his cavern. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on the end of the world. Chapter 64, The Symphony of the Cosmos. The dawn of the first day broke with an eerie, bloody red hue over the plains of Kurukshetra. The sheer noise of the gathering armies was deafening. The pounding of war drums, the trumpeting of tens of thousands of armored elephants, and the clash of shields created a cacophony that shook the clouds. Vivan stood atop a high rocky spire on the absolute edge of the battlefield, fully cloaked in shadow. His eye of Rudra took in the apocalyptic formations. In the center of the Pandava army stood a magnificent chariot drawn by 4 white horses. Standing tall in the back, wielding the divine Gandiva bow, was Arjuna. Sitting at the reins, calm amidst the sea of violence, was Krishna. The conch shells blew, signaling the start of the war. But suddenly, Arjuna's chariot surged forward, moving into the empty no-man's land directly between the 2 massive armies. Vivan leaned forward, his heart pounding. This is it. Down in the chariot, Arjuna looked across the battlefield. He didn't see an evil army of demons. He saw his beloved grandfather, Bhishma. He saw his revered teacher, Dronacharya. He saw his cousins, his uncles, and his childhood friends. The greatest warrior in the world suddenly collapsed. The Gandiva slipped from Arjuna's hands, hitting the floor of the chariot. He wept, his spirit completely broken by the horrific reality of killing his own blood for a piece of land. I cannot fight, Krishna, Arjuna cried out. I will not kill my grandfather. Let Duryodhana have the kingdom. I would rather live as a beggar than rule over the ashes of my family. The war paused. Millions of men watched the greatest archer of the age break down in tears. Krishna turned around in the chariot. He looked at his friend with deep, infinite compassion. And then, Krishna spoke. It wasn't a shout. It was a normal, conversational tone, yet Vivan, standing miles away on the spire, heard it echoing perfectly in his own mind. You mourn for those who are not worthy of grief, Arjuna. The wise mourn neither the living nor the dead. For there was never a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. Ding. Supreme cosmic singularity detected. The fabric of time has been temporarily suspended by the avatar. Vivan gasped as the world around him froze. The flapping banners stopped mid-wave. A bird flying overhead froze in the sky. The dust kicked up by millions of feet hung suspended in the air. The only things moving in the entire universe were Krishna, Arjuna, and Vivan, whose sky realm cultivation and aegis of the unbroken allowed his consciousness to endure the time stop. Krishna began to deliver the Bhagavad Gita. It was not just a speech, it was the downloading of absolute, unfiltered cosmic truth into the physical realm. Krishna spoke of karma, of duty, of the soul, and of the terrifying, beautiful mechanism of the universe. Vivan sat down on the spire, closing his eyes, letting his Brahmand gaze absorb the sheer, infinite resonance of the divine discourse. The words flowed through his meridians like liquid gold, fundamentally altering his understanding of prana, ojas, and existence itself. He watched as Krishna revealed his Vishvarupa, universal form, to Arjuna. This time, Vivan's mind did not bleed. He possessed the strength to look directly at the infinite spinning galaxies, the jaws of time consuming the warriors of the battlefield, and the blinding light of a million suns. Arjuna, his doubts completely eradicated, picked up the Gandiva bow. Time resumed with the violent, deafening roar of millions of men charging into battle. Ding. The greatest discourse witnessed. Sign-in overwhelmingly successful. Reward, supreme passive skill, the Gita's resonance. Effect, the host's ojas, divine energy, regeneration is now tied to the ambient friction of combat. The longer the host fights, the faster their energy replenishes. Fatigue is permanently disabled. Vivan stood up, the absolute truth of the cosmos settling in his bones. He was an engine of infinite energy now. He looked down at the chaotic, bloody meat grinder that the battlefield had instantly become. Let the slaughter begin, Vivan whispered, drawing his iron cleaver and melting into the shadows. Chapter 65, The First Blood. Day 1 of Kurukshetra was a nightmare for the Pandavas. Bhishma, the immortal grandfather leading the Kaurava army, was not just a general, he was a walking natural disaster. Wielding his celestial bow, Bhishma tore through the Pandava infantry like a scythe through wheat. Thousands of men died in the first hour alone. Arjuna and Bhima fought valiantly, but they were bogged down by the sheer numbers of the Kaurava vanguard and the restrictive rules of engagement. Vivan didn't enter the main fray. He stuck to the objective Krishna had given him. He stayed on the fringes, moving through the chaos like a ghost. His eye of Rudra continuously scanned the battlefield for anomalies, things that broke Bhishma's honorable rules of war. It didn't take long to find one. On the eastern flank, away from the heroic duels of the main commanders, a group of Pandava infantrymen were holding a defensive line against a heavy Kaurava chariot charge. Suddenly, the earth beneath the Pandava soldiers liquefied. It wasn't natural mud, it was a dark, bubbling alchemical sludge. The soldiers screamed as they sank waist deep, their armor melting, entirely trapped and unable to defend themselves against the approaching chariots. Standing on a chariot 100 yards away, chanting dark mantras, was a Kaurava mystic. Shakuni's dirty work. No striking a man who has lost his weapon or his footing, Vivan recited Bhishma's rules, his voice cold. Violation detected. Vivan activated Void Step. He didn't teleport to the soldiers. He folded space and appeared directly in the air, 10 feet above the speeding Kaurava chariot carrying the mystic. The mystic looked up just in time to see a man in a dark cloak plummeting toward him like a meteor. Vivan didn't use a weapon. He landed heavily on the front of the chariot, his iron bone physique shattering the wooden chassis instantly. The sheer kinetic impact flipped the massive war chariot entirely end over end. The horses screamed, breaking free of their harnesses. The mystic was violently thrown into the dirt, his dark spell instantly breaking as his concentration shattered. The Pandava soldiers on the flank gasped as the alchemical mud returned to solid earth, freeing them just before the rest of the Kaurava chariots reached their line. The mystic groaned, trying to push himself up from the dirt. He reached into his robes to draw a poisoned dagger. Vivan was already there. He walked out of the dust cloud of the shattered chariot, his golden eyes burning. Vivan grabbed the mystic by his robes, hauled him to his feet, and drove his ironwood knife directly up under the man's ribcage, piercing his dark heart. The shadows say hello, Vivan whispered into the dying man's ear. He dropped the body. Ding. Covered threat neutralized. Pandava eastern flank stabilized. Vivan didn't stop. He looked across the vast, bloody expanse of Kurukshetra. This was only the first hour of the first day. There were thousands of mystics, assassins, and foul players hidden within the 2 million soldiers of the Kaurava army. He activated his Shadow Weaver's cloak, his body dissolving into the bloody dust kicked up by a passing elephant. The commanders would fight for glory in the light. Vivan would fight for survival in the dark. The 18 days of annihilation had officially begun. Chapter 66, The Grind of the Graveyard. The first 9 days of Kurukshetra blurred into an endless, agonizing cycle of blood, dust, and roaring steel. By day, The earth shook as millions of men clashed under the burning sun. The rivers ran thick with gore, and the sky was constantly blotted out by clouds of celestial arrows. Bhishma remained an unstoppable force, a living mountain that the Pandavas simply could not break. But when the sun set and the conch shells blew to signal the end of the day's fighting, the true horror of the war began. The battlefield at night was a graveyard stretching for miles, filled with the moans of the dying and the stench of opened bowels. By the honorable rules of war, the fighting was supposed to stop. Both armies were meant to retreat to their tents, heal their wounds, and mourn their dead. Shakuni did not care for honor. Vivan lived in the darkness. His Cheetah's resonance passive skill meant he never needed to sleep. While the Pandava commanders rested, Vivan hunted. On the night of the seventh day, Vivan stalked through the corpse-strewn no-man's land in his Shadow Weaver's cloak. His karmic weaver skill illuminated the pitch-black battlefield with glowing red strings of malice. He found them near a massive pile of shattered chariots. A cabal of 12 Kaurava necromancers. They were kneeling in the bloody mud, chanting foul mantras, using the freshly spilled blood of Pandava soldiers to weave a debilitating curse meant for Yudhishthira's tent. Vivan didn't hesitate. He dropped from the top of a ruined elephant corpse, landing perfectly silently behind the lead necromancer. He grabbed the mystic's head with his titan's grip and twisted sharply. Snap. The chanting stopped. The remaining 11 mystics turned in horror. You disturb the dead, Vivan whispered, drawing his iron cleaver, his golden eyes burning like twin suns in the dark. He activated Void Step, folding space to teleport directly into the center of their circle. He swung the cleaver with Earthrealm force, bifurcating 2 necromancers at the waist before they could even draw a breath. A mystic fired a bolt of dark, necrotic lightning at him. Vivan didn't dodge. He let it strike his chest. His iron bone physique absorbed the kinetic impact, and his Yuga vitality instantly purged the necrotic poison from his blood. He smiled, raised his right hand, and fired a localized pulse of Earthrealm prana. The invisible shockwave crushed the mystic's ribcage into powder. In under a minute, the cabal was dead. The curse was broken. Ding. Covered threat neutralized. Ajah's reserves replenished. Vivan wiped his cleaver on a torn Kaurava banner. This was his existence now. He was the janitor of the apocalypse, cleaning up Shakuni's messes while the gods played their game of glory. But the board was about to change. Tomorrow was the 10th day. Chapter 67, The Fall of the Mountain. The 10th day of Kurukshetra broke with a chilling, solemn wind. Krishna had devised the strategy. Bhishma, bound by a vow of absolute chivalry, would never raise his weapon against a woman, or anyone who was once a woman. Shikhandi, a warrior of Panchala who had been born female but transformed into a male, was placed on Arjuna's chariot, acting as a human shield. Vivan watched from a high ridge, his eye of Rudra tracking the movements of the commanders. When Arjuna's chariot approached Bhishma, the immortal grandfather lowered his bow. He recognized Shikhandi. He accepted his fate. Arjuna, his heart breaking, drew the Gandiva. He unleashed a torrent of arrows so dense they blotted out the sun. The arrows pierced Bhishma's armor, striking him from every conceivable angle. Up on the ridge, Vivan's interface suddenly flashed a violently urgent red. Warning. Geopolitical interference detected. Vivan spun around. Half a mile away, hidden in the crags of a rocky hill overlooking Bhishma's position, were 3 Kaurava assassins. They held heavy, dark-forged crossbows aimed directly at Shikhandi's unprotected back. Shakuni had realized the plan and intended to kill the shield before Arjuna could finish the job. If Shikhandi died, Bhishma would resume fighting, and the Pandavas would lose the war today. Not happening, Vivan snarled. He couldn't close the half-mile gap in time. He materialized the Ananta Vambrace on his right arm, drawing the ethereal purple string back with terrifying speed. He channeled a massive surge of Ajahs into the gauntlet. He didn't aim at the assassins. He aimed at the rocky outcropping directly above them. Crack. The golden-white railgun bolt tore across the sky, a streak of miniature sunlight. It struck the cliff face above the assassins with the force of a meteor. Hundreds of tons of solid rock instantly sheared off the mountain, burying the 3 snipers in an avalanche of stone and dust before they could pull their triggers. Down on the battlefield, the shower of arrows concluded. Bhishma, the grand patriarch of the Kuru clan, fell from his chariot. But he did not touch the earth. His body was so completely pierced by Arjuna's arrows that he was suspended in the air, resting entirely upon a bed of shafts. A profound, agonizing silence fell over the 2 million men of Kurukshetra. The fighting stopped entirely as soldiers from both sides dropped their weapons and wept for the fallen titan. Ding. Supreme event witnessed, the bed of arrows. Task condition met. Interference prevented. Reward, legendary passive, Ikshamritayu, fragment of the grandfather's will, ... Effect, the host gains extreme, supernatural pain tolerance. Fatal wounds will not cause immediate death or loss of consciousness, the host's body will fight to remain alive until the absolute depletion of Yuga vitality. Vivan let out a heavy breath, watching from the ridge. The grandfather had fallen. The era of honorable warfare was officially over. From tomorrow onward, under the command of Dronacharya, the war would become a bloodbath of pure survival. Chapter 68, The Lotus of Death. Day 13. The sky wept a light, miserable drizzle. Dronacharya, now the supreme commander of the Kaurava army, had woven the ultimate military formation, the Chakravyuha. It was a massive, rotating labyrinth of tens of thousands of heavily armored soldiers, moving in a hypnotic, impenetrable lotus pattern. Only 2 men on the Pandava side knew how to breach it, Krishna and Arjuna. And they had been drawn far away to the southern edge of the battlefield by a suicide squad specifically designed to distract them. Yudhishthira was trapped. If the Pandavas didn't break the formation, the Kaurava army would crush their vanguard entirely. I know how to enter it, uncle, a young, brave voice called out. It was Abhimanyu, the 16-year-old son of Arjuna. He possessed the strength of a demigod and the heart of a lion. Vivan was currently deep within the Kaurava lines, assassinating a group of dark mystics attempting to summon a fog bank. When his karmic weaver skill flared, he looked back toward the Pandava lines. He saw a single, bright, golden string of fate Abhimanyu charging directly into the massive, grinding meat grinder of the Chakravyuha. The boy breached the outer ring, but King Jayadratha of the Kauravas immediately used a divine boon from Shiva to block the breach, trapping the other Pandavas outside. Abhimanyu was locked inside the labyrinth alone with the greatest warriors of the Kaurava army. No, Vivan breathed, panic suddenly gripping his chest. Vivan knew the lore. This was the tragedy that defined the war. Abhimanyu would fight like a god, but he would be brutally and unfairly slaughtered by 6 commanders attacking him simultaneously, a gross violation of the rules of war. System. Vivan roared, dropping his stealth and activating his Skyrealm aura. I'm going in. Vivan sprinted toward the massive, rotating wall of Kaurava infantry. He activated Void Step, intending to fold space and teleport directly into the center of the Lotus formation to pull the boy out. Warning. Spatial fold failed. The Chakravyuha is a celestial tear array. The sheer density of Dronakarya's martial intent and the combined prana of 100,000 soldiers has locked the spatial fabric. Teleportation is disabled within a 1-mile radius. Damn it. Vivan screamed, drawing his heavy iron cleaver. He crashed into the outer wall of the formation like a runaway train. His thunderclap strike shattered the shields and bodies of 20 spearmen, blasting a hole in the line. Vivan fought with a feral, terrifying desperation. He was a demigod of the earth, his cleaver a blur of iron and blood. He slaughtered his way through the first ring, then the second. He took spears to the shoulders and arrows to the thighs, his Ikshamritai passive ignoring the pain entirely as his Yuga vitality healed the wounds. But the labyrinth shifted. The walls of men rotated, closing the gaps, constantly turning him around. It was like fighting an ocean. By the time Vivan ripped his way into the 7th and final ring, his armor was painted crimson, his chest heaving with exertion. He was too late. In the center of the ring, surrounded by the corpses of thousands of Kaurava soldiers he had killed single-handedly, stood the 16-year-old Abhimanyu. His chariot was destroyed. His bow was broken. He was fighting with the wheel of his chariot, bleeding from 100 wounds. Drona, Karna, Duryodhana, Dushasana, Ashwathama, and Kripasharya, 6 legendary commanders attacked the boy simultaneously from all sides. A mace blow from behind shattered Abhimanyu's skull. The boy fell into the bloody mud. Vivan froze at the edge of the ring. The golden interface flashed a dull, somber gray. Tragic event witnessed, the fall of the lion cub. Notice, fate cannot always be broken. The wheel of karma turns. Vivan stared at the boy's body, his hands trembling violently. He hadn't been fast enough. He was a demigod, and he was still too weak to break the absolute chains of the timeline. Duryodhana and the Kaurava commanders cheered, celebrating the brutal murder of a child. Vivan's golden eyes slowly turned to dark, burning crimson. The shadows around him began to writhe and hiss, reacting to his sheer, unchecked fury. He didn't attack the commanders to do so would reveal his existence and ruin Krishna's plan. But as he slowly melted backward into the shadows to retreat, Vivan made a vow of his own. You want to play without rules, Duryodhana? Vivan thought, his eyes thrumming with dark, apocalyptic intent. Fine. The shadows are taking the gloves off. Chapter 69, The Vow of Fire. The Pandava camp that night was an abyss of grief. Arjuna had returned to find his beloved son murdered. The greatest archer in the world did not just weep, he erupted into a terrifying, world-ending rage. Standing before the funeral pyre of his son, Arjuna raised his hands to the heavens. Hear my vow. Arjuna screamed, his voice carrying across the entire plains of Kurukshetra. Tomorrow, before the sun sets, I will kill Jayadratha, the man who blocked the gates and trapped my son. If I fail to sever his head before sunset, I will step into a fire and burn myself alive. It was a suicidal vow. When the news reached the Kaurava camp, Duryodhana laughed. He immediately ordered Dronacharya to hide Jayadratha at the absolute rear of their army, protected by 3 impenetrable, complex military formations and hundreds of thousands of their best troops. All they had to do was stall Arjuna for 1 day, and the Pandavas would lose their greatest warrior to suicide. Day 14. The fighting was more ferocious than any day prior. Arjuna, driven by absolute madness and grief, fought like the god of death himself. His chariot, driven by Krishna, tore through the first 2 formations, leaving a trail of thousands of corpses in his wake. But the Kauravas threw everything they had at him. Waves of reserves poured onto the field, slowing Arjuna's progress. Vivan was not in the center of the field. He was miles away, perched on a high ridge overlooking the Kaurava reinforcement routes. Krishna had tasked him to be the unseen shield. Today, Vivan was the unseen sword. A massive column of 10,000 Kaurava heavy cavalry was thundering down a narrow canyon, intending to flank Arjuna and bog him down in a melee. Vivan manifested the Anant of Embrace. He didn't aim at the soldiers. He aimed at the precarious, towering rock formations lining the lip of the canyon. He drew the purple string back, channeling a massive surge of ajas. Crack. The solar beam hit the canyon wall. Crack. 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 Vivan fired 4 times in rapid succession. The entire side of the canyon violently collapsed, sending tens of thousands of tons of rock crashing down into the pass, instantly crushing the vanguard of the cavalry and completely blocking the route. The reinforcements were trapped. Ding. Strategic intervention successful. Flank secured. Vivan didn't stop. He void-stepped across the peaks, tracking the movements of the Corps of Reserves through his Eye of Rudra. Wherever Shakuni sent hidden archers to snipe Krishna's horses, Vivan was there in the shadows, slitting throats. Wherever mystics tried to summon magical fog to obscure Jayadratha's location, Vivan dropped from the sky and crushed their skulls. He was a one-man natural disaster operating entirely behind enemy lines, systematically dismantling every dirty trick Shakuni tried to play. But despite Vivan's massive interference, the sheer distance and volume of the Kaurava army was too great. The sun began to bleed into a deep, bruised orange on the western horizon. Arjuna was exhausted, bleeding, and still miles away from the rearguard where Jayadratha was hiding. The Kaurava soldiers began to cheer, mocking the great archer. The sun was setting. Arjuna had failed. Chapter 70, The Sun Sets Early. Vivan stood on a blood-soaked hill, decapitating a Kaurava mystic who had been trying to curse Arjuna's bowstring. He looked up at the sky, panting heavily. The sun was dropping below the horizon. It was over. But then, Vivan felt a sudden, terrifying shift in the ambient prana of the entire planet. Down in the chariot, Krishna stood up. The avatar of Vishnu raised his right hand toward the sky. He did not summon a weapon. He summoned the Sudarshana Chakra, the cosmic disc of absolute divine authority. But Krishna didn't throw it at the enemy. He commanded the chakra to fly upward, directly into the stratosphere, expanding its physical mass to an impossible, planet-dwarfing scale. The chakra eclipsed the sun. Instantly, the plains of Kurukshetra were plunged into absolute, pitch-black night. The Kaurava army erupted into deafening cheers. The sun had set. The day was over. Arjuna had lost his vow. Jayadratha, who had been cowering in the absolute rear of the army behind walls of shields, couldn't contain his relief. Believing he was safe, the king stood up in his chariot, poking his head over the shield wall to look toward Arjuna's chariot and laugh at his defeated enemy. Up on the hill, Vivan's karmic weaver skill flared. He saw Shakuni's top 3 astrologers and seers, standing on a nearby ridge. Their eyes were glowing with dark magic. They were reading the celestial alignments and realized the truth: the sun hadn't set. The time was wrong. It was an illusion. Blow the horn, the lead seer screamed, reaching for a massive conch shell. Warn Jayadratha. It's a trick. If they blew the horn, Jayadratha would duck back behind the shields, and Arjuna would miss his one window of opportunity. Shut up, Vivan snarled. He activated Void Step, teleporting directly onto the ridge behind the 3 seers. He didn't use a weapon. He grabbed the lead seer by the back of the neck with his titan's grip and squeezed, shattering his cervical spine before his lips could touch the conch shell. The other 2 seers turned in terror, but Vivan's hands were a blur. 2 thunderclap strikes caved in their chests simultaneously, sending them flying off the ridge in silence. Down on the battlefield, the illusion held. Jayadratha was still standing tall, laughing into the darkness. Krishna lowered his hand. The Sudarshana Chakra instantly shrank and vanished back into the ether. The eclipse broke. The brilliant, blinding light of the late afternoon sun flooded the battlefield once more. The Kaurava cheers died in their throats, replaced by absolute, mind-shattering horror. The sun was still high in the sky. Arjuna. Krishna's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. The sun is still up. And your enemy's neck is exposed. Arjuna, his eyes burning with tears of rage and gratitude, drew the Gandiva back to his ear. He fired a single, celestial arrow. The arrow tore across the miles of battlefield, a streak of divine retribution. It struck Jayadratha perfectly through the neck, severing his head from his shoulders before the king even had time to realize he had been tricked. The Pandava army erupted into a roar of absolute triumph that shook the very foundations of the earth. Up on the ridge, standing over the dead seers, Vivan collapsed to his knees, utterly exhausted. He had fought for 14 hours straight, burning ajas at a terrifying rate to keep the board clear for the avatar. The golden interface materialized, glowing softly in the fading daylight. Ding. Supreme cosmic event witnessed, the eclipse of the avatar. Covered objective achieved, warning suppressed. The vow is fulfilled. Reward, path to the sovereign realm unlocked. Host's ajas density has crystallized. You are entering the realm of the absolute. Vivan laid back against the blood-stained rocks, staring up at the real sunset. They had survived day 14. But the cost was growing, and the most terrifying warriors of the Kaurava army, Drona and Karna, were still alive. 4 more days, Vivan whispered to the wind. Just 4 more days. Chapter 71, The Night of the Rakshasas. The rules of honorable warfare had been entirely incinerated. Following the death of Jayadratha, Duryodhana's rage consumed the last shreds of his sanity. He ordered his army to ignite their torches and continue the slaughter into the night, a gross violation of the ancient codes. The battlefield of Kurukshetra transformed into a terrifying, flickering hellscape. But the night did not belong to the Kauravas. It belonged to the monsters. Bhima's son, Gadokeka, a half-Rakshasa born of the demoness Hidimbi, grew to an impossible, towering height in the darkness. His dark magic, fueled by the night, made him an unstoppable calamity. He hurled entire flaming chariots through the air, crushing Kaurava battalions by the thousands. Vivan was currently 3 miles above the battlefield, standing on a jagged cliff face overlooking the carnage. Ding. Geopolitical shift detected, the Night of the Demons. Covered objective, ensure the Vasavai Shakti is expended. Vivan looked down, his eye of Rudra cutting through the smoke and magical darkness. He knew the absolute crux of this battle. Karna possessed the Vasavai Shakti, an infallible, divine dart granted to him by Indra. It could only be used once, and it guaranteed the death of any single opponent. Karna had been saving it exclusively for Arjuna. If Karna kept it, Arjuna would die tomorrow. Krishna's plan was to unleash Ghatotkacha to wreak such apocalyptic havoc that Karna would be forced to use the dart to save the Kaurava army. But Vivan's karmic weaver picked up an anomaly. Hovering in the dark clouds above the battlefield were 6 Kaurava mystics, cloaked in invisibility yantras. They were weaving a massive, suppressive spell net of light magic designed to shrink Ghatotkacha back to mortal size, which would render him manageable without the Vasavai Shakti. No, you don't, Vivan whispered. Vivan activated Void Step, folding space to teleport directly into the toxic, black clouds. He materialized amidst the 6 hovering mystics. He didn't use stealth. He unleashed his absolute sky realm Ajas. The sheer, crushing pressure of a demigod erupting in their midst caused the mystics' levitation spells to violently destabilize. The shadow, one screamed, recognizing the golden, burning eyes from the rumors. Vivan summoned the Anant of Embrace. He didn't fire the solar beam, he used the gauntlet as a bludgeoning weapon. He shattered the first mystic's skull with a backhand that echoed like a thunderclap. He grabbed the second by the throat, channeling his Agni Astra fragment to literally boil the blood in the man's veins. The remaining 4 panicked, firing bolts of dark lightning at him. Vivan didn't dodge. His Aegis of the Unbroken shattered the magical bindings, and his iron bone physique absorbed the lightning. He was a force of nature. He void stepped 3 times in rapid succession, snapping 3 necks before they could draw another breath. He dropped the final mystic from the clouds, plunging the man thousands of feet into the bloody mud below. With the suppressive spell broken, Ghatotkacha roared, expanding even larger, his footfalls causing localized earthquakes. Duryodhana, watching his army being utterly annihilated, rode frantically to Karna. Kill the beast. Use the dart. If you don't, there will be no army left for you to lead tomorrow. Karna closed his eyes, the weight of his tragic destiny pressing down on him. He summoned the Vasavai Shakti. It pulsed with the absolute, terrifying light of a dying star. He hurled it into the sky. The divine dart struck Ghatotkacha, instantly incinerating the giant Rakshasa's heart. The monster fell, crushing another entire Kaurava division beneath his massive corpse. Ding. Covered objective achieved. The Vasavai Shakti has been neutralized. The Avatar's path is secure. Vivan hovered in the clouds, watching the giant fall. It was a tragic, necessary sacrifice. Arjuna was safe, but the cost of this war was beginning to weigh heavily on Vivan's soul. Chapter 72, The Fall of the Master, Day 15. Dronacharya was no longer a man, he was an avatar of destruction. The loss of his soldiers had driven the Supreme Commander into a state of martial transcendence. He summoned the Brahmadanda, the absolute celestial barrier, making himself entirely immune to all mortal and divine weapons. He was slaughtering the Pandava army by the tens of thousands. Krishna, realizing Drona could not be defeated in combat, orchestrated the most controversial moment of the war. Bhima killed an elephant named Ashwathama, which was also the name of Drona's beloved son. Bhima roared across the battlefield, Ashwathama is dead. Drona froze. He turned to Yudhishthira, the man who had never told a lie in his life, and asked for the truth. Ashwathama is dead, Yudhishthira said, his voice carrying over the din of battle. Then, he muttered under his breath, whether man or elephant, I do not know. Drona's spirit shattered. The great master dropped his weapons, sat down in his chariot, and entered a deep meditative state, his soul preparing to leave his body. Drishtadhyumna, the fire-born prince of Panchala destined to kill Drona, rushed forward with his sword drawn. But as the prince approached the chariot, his sword struck an invisible, crackling wall of pure kinetic energy. Drona's Brahmadanda barrier was still active. His subconscious mind was protecting his physical body. I cannot pierce it. Drishtadhyumna screamed, hacking frantically at the invisible wall. Up on a rocky outcrop, Vivan's interface flashed. Ding. Supreme event anomaly detected. The timeline is stalling. The master's final ward must be broken. Vivan didn't hesitate. He knew he couldn't walk up and shatter it with a punch. The backlash of a supreme astral barrier would vaporize even his sky realm body. He needed pure, hyper-compressed celestial penetration. Vivan manifested the Anant of Embrace. He channeled every single drop of Ajas in his core, pulling heavily on the ambient heat of the battlefield. The solar meridian screamed, the light turning a blinding, terrifying white. I'm not aiming for Drona, Vivan thought. I'm aiming for the shield. He fired. The Mach 4 railgun bolt tore across the battlefield. It struck the invisible, dome-like barrier surrounding Drona's chariot. The collision of celestial defense and cosmic dark matter offense created a sound that deafened thousands of men. The Brahmadanda rippled, turned a sickly violet, and then shattered like a massive pane of stained glass. Drishtadhyumna didn't stop to wonder where the blast came from. With the barrier down, the prince vaulted into the chariot and swung his heavy broadsword. Dronacharya's head fell to the bloody earth. Ding. Supreme cosmic event witnessed, the fall of the Guru. Sign-in successful. Reward, High-tier tactical core, the Guru's insight. Effect, the host gains instantaneous comprehension of complex military formations, celestial arrays, and magical wards. Vivan collapsed back against the rocks, his right arm smoking, his ojas entirely depleted. The Pandava army cheered, but Yudhishthira's chariot, which had always floated an inch above the ground due to his pure righteousness, sank heavily into the mud. The lie had tainted him. The Kaurava army wept. Karna was immediately crowned the new supreme commander. The sun set on day 15, paving the way for the ultimate showdown. Chapter 73, The Blood of Dushasana. Day 16. The war had devolved into pure, primal hatred. In the center of the battlefield, a massive circle had formed. Pandava and Kaurava soldiers alike stopped fighting to watch the nightmare unfolding in the mud. Bhima had finally cornered Dushasana, the man who had dragged Draupadi by her hair in the assembly hall. Vivan stood cloaked in shadow near the edge of the circle. His eye of Rudra was locked onto the surrounding Kaurava lines, searching for any hidden archers or mystics who might try to intervene. Bhima didn't fight with a weapon. He fought with the wrath of a wounded god. He tackled Dushasana to the earth, his massive fists raining down like meteors. He shattered Dushasana's armor, broke his arms, and pinned him to the bloody mud. Remember the assembly hall. Bhima roared, his voice tearing the sky. Remember the Empress. With a terrifying, guttural scream, Bhima plunged his bare hands into Dushasana's chest. He ripped the prince's ribcage open. True to his horrific vow, Bhima cupped the blood pouring from Dushasana's heart and drank it, his face painted crimson. The Kaurava soldiers recoiled in absolute, mind-numbing horror. Many dropped their weapons and fled the field, believing Bhima was not a man, but a Rakshasa of the underworld. From the Kaurava lines, a contingent of elite guards loyalists of Shakuni drew heavy, poisoned javelins, preparing to hurl them into Bhima's exposed back while he was lost in his bloodlust. Vivan's karmic weaver caught the shift in intent instantly. He void-stepped directly behind the line of guards. He didn't use a weapon. He used his Titan's grip and Earthrealm momentum. He grabbed the heads of the two outermost guards and violently slammed them together, crushing their skulls. He spun, his iron bone physique shattering a thrusting spear, and drove a thunderclap strike directly into the chest of the captain, blowing his heart out through his back. In 5 seconds, the 8 guards were dead, their bodies dragged silently into the Devourer's vault. Bhima remained entirely untouched, standing over the ruined corpse of Dushasana, letting out a roar of absolute, terrifying triumph. Ding! Covered objective maintained, vengeance undisturbed. Vivan melted back into the shadows, his expression grim. The vows were being fulfilled. The Kaurava princes were dying. Duryodhana's empire was crumbling into dust and bone. Tomorrow was the 17th day. Tomorrow, the sun and the storm would collide. Chapter 74, The Clash of the Sun and the Storm. Day 17. The heavens themselves seemed to pause to watch. The battlefield cleared a massive, 2-mile radius. In the center, 2 chariots circled each other like celestial dragons. Arjuna, the avatar of Indra, the storm, wielding the Gandiva. Karna, the son of Surya, the sun, wielding his absolute divine bow, Vijaya. The sheer force of their archery defied mortal comprehension. Arrows met arrows in midair, creating explosions of fire, water, wind, and lightning. The sky flashed through every color of the spectrum. It was a beautiful, terrifying dance of absolute martial perfection. Vivan sat atop the rotting corpse of a dead elephant a mile away, his eye of Rudra struggling to process the sheer density of the celestial trajectories. But Karna was fighting under the weight of 3 terrible curses. A Brahmin had cursed his chariot wheel to sink into the earth during his most crucial battle. His guru, Parashurama, had cursed him to forget his greatest divine mantras when he needed them most. And he had given away his impenetrable golden armor to Indra in a supreme act of charity. Despite all this, Karna was fighting Arjuna to a standstill. He was arguably pushing the Pandava back. But Shakuni, watching from a distance, did not trust Karna's honor. Vivan's karmic weaver flashed. A mile behind Arjuna's chariot, a massive, subterranean tunnel was collapsing. Shakuni had deployed a squad of Naga, serpent, assassins to burrow under the battlefield and strike Krishna's horses from below. If the horses fell, Arjuna's chariot would be immobilized, rendering him an easy target. Always a cheat, Shakuni, Vivan snarled. He activated Void Step, folding space repeatedly to cross the mile in seconds. He arrived at the subterranean breach point just as the massive, heavily armored Nagas burst from the earth, their fangs dripping with neurotoxin. Vivan dropped from the sky, his iron cleaver vibrating with Skyrealm Majas. He didn't hold back. He cleaved the first Naga perfectly in half, the sheer kinetic force of the swing sending a shockwave into the tunnel that crushed the second serpent against the earth. The final Naga lunged, biting Vivan directly on the shoulder. Vivan didn't flinch. His lesser poison immunity struggled against the divine tear venom, but his Ikshamrutai passive, pain immunity, allowed him to ignore the searing agony entirely. Vivan grabbed the Naga by the jaw with his Titan's grip and violently ripped its head in two. He stood over the dead serpents, pulling the severed fang from his shoulder, his golden eyes burning. Ding! Covered threat neutralized. The duel remains unbroken. Vivan looked toward the center of the battlefield. The climax of the war had arrived. Chapter 75, The Broken Wheel. As Vivan neutralized the Nagas, the fatal curse of the Brahmin finally took hold of Karna. The earth beneath Karna's chariot suddenly turned to liquid mud. The left wheel sank deep into the bloody soil, grinding the massive war machine to a halt. Karna's charioteer, King Shailya, refused to help him lift it, mocking the warrior of the sun. Karna, realizing the gravity of the moment, lowered his bow. He leaped down into the mud, grabbing the massive wooden wheel with his bare hands, straining his demigod strength to lift it free. Wait, Arjuna! Karna called out, his voice echoing with desperate nobility. The rules of Dharma dictate you cannot strike a warrior who is unarmed and dismounted. Give me a moment to free my wheel. Arjuna hesitated. He lowered the Gandiva. The code of chivalry was ingrained in his soul. But Krishna, standing in the chariot, his eyes cold with the weight of absolute cosmic justice, turned to his friend. Where was Dharma when Abhimanyu was slaughtered by 6 men? Krishna's voice boomed, shattering the silence of the battlefield. Where was Dharma when Draupadi was dragged into the assembly hall? Where was Dharma when they tried to burn you alive in the house of Lak? Strike him, Arjuna. This is your duty. Arjuna's eyes hardened. The grief of his murdered son washed away his hesitation. He drew the Gandiva back to his ear, summoning the Angelica Astra, a crescent-shaped arrow of absolute, decapitating force. Down in the mud, Karna saw the arrow drawn. He realized Parashurama's curse had taken effect, his mind was blank, unable to summon the counter-mantra. He looked up at the sun, a serene, tragic acceptance washing over his face. Arjuna released the string. The arrow flashed like a silver crescent moon. It struck Karna's neck, cleanly severing the head of the greatest, most tragic warrior of the era. Karna's body fell backward into the mud. A brilliant, golden light erupted from his corpse, ascending directly into the sky to merge with the sun. The battlefield was plunged into absolute silence. The Kaurava army's spirit was instantly and permanently broken. Men dropped their swords, weeping. Duryodhana fell to his knees in his chariot, a hollow, despairing wail tearing from his throat. He had lost his brother, his guru, and now his greatest friend. Miles away, Vivan sat on the hood of a shattered chariot, his cloak stained with serpent blood. He watched the golden light ascend into the sky. The golden interface materialized before him, glowing with a somber, heavy light. Ding! Supreme cosmic event witnessed, the setting of the Sunday. Sign-in successful. Reward, Supreme Ascension Core, the will of the fallen. Notice, the host's covered objectives are complete. The Kaurava army is effectively annihilated. The sovereign realm is within reach. Vivan closed his eyes. The war was functionally over. All that remained was the final, bloody hunt for Duryodhana and Shakuni. Rest well, warrior of the sun, Vivan whispered into the quiet wind. The shadows will finish this. Here are chapters 76 through 80, bringing the apocalyptic Kurukshetra war to its bloody, climactic end, and pushing Vivan to the absolute zenith of his power. Chapter 76, The Lake of Blood. Day 18. The Grand Kaurava army, which had once boasted over 2 million men, was reduced to ash and carrion. The plains of Kurukshetra were a horrific monument to human pride, carpeted with the shattered remains of chariots, elephants, and kings. Only a handful of Kaurava warriors remained. And Duryodhana was running. The crown prince of Hastinapur, stripped of his army, his brothers, and his invincible commanders, fled the battlefield on foot. His royal armor was cracked, his breathing ragged. Using a dark, aquatic mantra taught to him by an ancient sage, Duryodhana plunged into the murky waters of the Dvapara lake, solidifying the water around him to create an impenetrable subaquatic bunker. He intended to hide, rest, and fight another day. Vivan stood on the shattered remains of a war elephant on the edge of the lake. He didn't need the karmic weaver to find Duryodhana, the sheer density of the prince's terrified, humiliated aura was radiating through the water like a beacon. But Vivan wasn't looking at the lake. His golden eyes were scanning the decimated battlefield behind him. Duryodhana is here, Vivan murmured to himself, the cold wind whipping his blood-stained cloak. But where is the spider? Shakuni was missing. The prince of Gandhara was a coward in open combat, but he was a mastermind of spite. If the war was lost, Shakuni wouldn't just run away. He would try to inflict one final, unspeakable wound on the Pandavas. Vivan's eye of Rudra flared, pushing his sky realm perception to its absolute limit. He scanned the horizon, filtering out the auras of the dead and dying. He found a single, vile, pulsing black string of karma moving rapidly away from the battlefield, heading not toward Hastinapur, but toward the unguarded Pandava encampment where the women, the children, and the wounded rested. Not today, you rat, Vivan snarled. He activated Void Step, the fabric of space folding around him as he vanished from the lake, leaving the Pandavas to discover Duryodhana's hiding place on their own. It was time to settle a 13-year-old score. Chapter 77, The Final Roll of the Dice. The Pandava camp was eerily quiet, the few remaining guards looking anxiously toward the distant horizon where the war was ending. Shakuni, cloaked in a heavy, tattered traveler's robe, limped toward the outer perimeter. He was bleeding from a stray arrow, his face pale and haggard. In his trembling hand, he clutched a glowing, obsidian dagger. If he could just slip into Draupadi's tent, he could slit her throat and deny Yudhishthira his empress. It was a petty, spiteful endgame. You always did prefer the back door, Shakuni. The prince of Gandhara froze. Stepping out from the shadows of a massive supply tent was Vivan. The mythic aura concealment dropped entirely. The absolute, crushing weight of Vivan's sky realm mages slammed down on the camp perimeter. The nearby guards instantly passed out from the spiritual pressure. Shakuni staggered backward, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The shadow demon, he hissed, his voice cracking. I told you, Vivan said, his golden eyes burning, his voice echoing with the resonance of the earth itself. I told you 13 years ago in Hastinapur. I said I would come for you. Shakuni let out a desperate, manic laugh. He dropped the dagger and reached into his robes, pulling out his cursed, pale yellow bone dice. You think you have won? Shakuni screamed, his eyes glowing with necrotic, dark magic. I am the master of the board. I summon the fathers of Gandhara. Shakuni hurled the dice onto the dirt. They didn't roll. They shattered. From the shards of bone, a colossal, terrifying geyser of dark magic erupted. The earth tore open, and a massive, four-armed necrotic Ashura composed entirely of shadows and rotting bone clawed its way out of the ground. It was Shakuni's ultimate trump card, a calamity tier manifestation of pure, concentrated malice. Kill him! Shakuni shrieked. Vivan didn't even draw his cleaver. He didn't manifest the Anant of Embrace. He looked at the towering bone demon with absolute, chilling boredom. I am a demigod of the earth, Vivan whispered. You think you can summon dirt against me? Vivan raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. A hyperdense, localized gravity well of Earthrealm prana instantly materialized around the calamity tier demon. The sheer kinetic pressure was astronomical. The monster didn't even have time to roar before it was violently crushed into a sphere of dense, compacted bone dust no larger than a marble. Vivan let his hand drop. The marble of bone dust fell harmlessly into the dirt. Shakuni fell to his knees, his mind entirely shattered by the casual display of supreme power. He stared at Vivan, weeping, holding up his hands in a pathetic plea for mercy. Vivan walked forward, his footsteps silent. He stopped in front of the Prince of Gandhara. The house always loses, Vivan said. Vivan reached out, his titan's grip locking onto Shakuni's skull. With a sharp, merciless twist, he snapped the architect of the Kurukshetra war's neck. Ding! Supreme covered threat neutralized. The root of the war has been severed. Massive karmic influx detected. Vivan dropped the body into the dust. He felt a terrifying, boundless energy surging into his core. The sovereign realm was agonizingly close. But the war wasn't over yet. He looked back toward the battlefield. The final duel was about to begin. Chapter 78, The Shattered Thigh. When Vivan arrived back at Dvapara Lake, the final act of the tragedy was already underway. Duryodhana had been taunted out of the water by the Pandavas. The crown prince, armed with his massive iron mace, stood facing Bhima in the center of a wide, muddy circle. The remaining kings and Krishna stood on the periphery. Vivan took his place on a high ridge, cloaked in shadow, watching through the eye of Rudra. The mace duel was apocalyptic. Every clash of their weapons sent shockwaves rippling across the plains, shattering the armor of dead soldiers miles away. But Duryodhana had a terrifying advantage. Before the battle, his mother, Queen Gandhari, had removed her blindfold for the first time in her life, casting her powerful, accumulated spiritual gaze upon her son. Turning his entire body as hard as diamonds. Except for his thighs, which he had covered out of modesty. Bhima was fighting with the rage of a tempest, but his mace simply bounced off Duryodhana's torso. Bhima was tiring. He was bleeding. He was losing. Bhima cannot win this fairly, Vivan muttered, his muscles tensing. Duryodhana's durability is absolute. Down in the circle, Duryodhana laughed, swinging his mace and knocking Bhima to his knees. Is this the wrath you promised, Bhima? You are weak. Krishna, standing on the edge of the circle, caught Bhima's desperate, exhausted gaze. The avatar did not speak. He simply raised his left hand and casually slapped his own thigh. Bhima's eyes widened. He remembered his horrific vow from the assembly hall 13 years ago, I will smash Duryodhana's thigh with my mace. But striking below the waist in a mace duel was a gross violation of the honorable rules of combat. It was a sin. Bhima didn't care. With a terrifying roar, Bhima ducked under Duryodhana's next swing. He spun, putting every ounce of his demigod strength into his weapon, and brought the massive iron mace crashing directly into Duryodhana's unprotected thighs. Crack! The sound of Duryodhana's femurs shattering echoed like a falling redwood tree. The crown prince of Hastinapur screamed in absolute agony, his diamond-hard body crashing heavily into the bloody mud. He could not stand. His empire was broken. The Pandavas cheered, but Balarama, Krishna's older brother and the master of mace warfare, was furious at the foul play. He raised his weapon to execute Bhima for breaking the rules. Krishna stepped in, calming his brother, reminding him of the countless times Duryodhana had broken the rules of Dharma first. The debate of morality raged, but the physical reality remained, the war was won. Duryodhana lay dying in the mud, cursing Krishna and the Pandavas with his final breaths. Up on the ridge, Vivan watched the sun set on the 18th day. The Kurukshetra war was officially over. The Pandavas were the undisputed emperors of the Aryavarta. But Vivan's karmic weaver was flashing wildly. The strings of fate were not settling into peace. They were tangling into a knot of pure, unadulterated madness. Ashwathama, Vivan whispered, his blood running cold. Chapter 79, The Midnight Massacre. The Pandava camp was celebrating their ultimate victory. But Krishna, sensing the impending doom, had ordered the 5 Pandava brothers to sleep outside the camp that night. They left behind the army, the women, and the 5 young sons of Draupadi, the Upapandavas, believing the war was over and they were safe. They were wrong. Ashwathama, the son of Dronacharya, had witnessed Duryodhana dying in the mud. Driven entirely mad by grief and rage over the deceitful murder of his father, Ashwatthama swore an oath to wipe out the Pandava bloodline. He possessed a terrifying boon from Lord Shiva. In the dead of night, Ashwatthama became an avatar of pure, divine destruction. He bypassed the camp guards, slaughtering them in their sleep. He entered the tent of Drishtadhyumna, the man who killed his father and brutally beat him to death with his bare hands. Then, Ashwatthama moved toward the royal tent where Draupadi's 5 young sons slept. He intended to behead them, ending the Pandava lineage forever. Warning. Absolute crisis detected. The timeline dictates the death of the UK Pandavas. However, the host's karmic accumulation allows for an override. Task: defy fate. Save the innocent. Vivan didn't even read the reward. He activated void step, folding space repeat.